Welcome to Primetime Weekend. I'm Nicole Wallace. Let's get right to the week's top stories. 22 witnesses, 21 days of court, 80 hours of witness testimony later. The first ever criminal trial of an American ex-president is coming to a close. A week from right now, the fate of the ex-president and presumptive Republican presidential nominee could be in the hands of 12 everyday New Yorkers from all walks of life. The prosecution has one last chance to hammer home its case against Donald Trump in closing arguments. That happens on Tuesday. And given that the defense put up just 2 witnesses, their 8-hour cross-examination of Michael Cohen lasting 4 times longer than their entire presentation, only the Manhattan DA is wrestling with the challenge of reminding the jury about all the testimony it presented, all that documentary evidence, the bombshell after bombshell after bombshell that dropped day after day after day over 4 weeks now. As a reminder, here's just some of what the jury heard as told by the press covering it.
Jurors listening intently today as the former publisher of the National Enquirer testified about the confidential arrangement made with Trump in 2015 to help his presidential campaign.
Hope Hicks, one of his former top advisors, telling the jury about that now infamous Access Hollywood tape in 2016.
Hicks also cast doubt on the defense's argument that Michael Cohen made the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels out of the kindness of Cohen's heart.
Jurors also saw McConney's handwritten notes that worked out the monthly reimbursements and the checks Trump signed while at the White House.
Adult film star Stormy Daniels was questioned in detail about an alleged sexual encounter with Donald Trump back in 2006.
Michael Cohen testifying against his former boss. Mr. Trump's former fixer turned foe, Michael Cohen, taking the stand for his highly anticipated testimony.
Michael Cohen brought Donald Trump closer than any witness yet to the alleged scheme to protect his political fortunes and obscure his role in covering up stories about sex.
So all the testimony and all of the evidence is intended to drive home the point that the entire conspiracy to conceal hush money payments that were made to suppress damaging information about Donald Trump from getting out and being known by the American voter before the 2016 election was done at the behest of and at the direction of Donald Trump. Now, during his opening statement, Trump's attorney Todd Blanche asked the court this question, quote, "Think for a moment. Would a frugal businessman, would a man who pinches pennies repay a $130,000 debt to the tune of $420,000? To that question, prosecutors said, heck yes, and they showed where the math was done. They brought a wealth of circumstantial evidence and such documents to make their case. From Trump org employee Jeff McConney, not just explaining the documents that show how Trump's employees got to that $420,000 figure, but also how they sought to conceal the hush money. McConney also revealing that Donald Trump is a boss who kept a very close eye on every one of his pennies. To Trump's own words from his own books that reveal he was a proud, self-described micromanager and cheapskate, making it all the more plausible that he had to have known about a plan to conceal payments made to Stormy Daniels. As for Trump's team, they will be coming off of an attempt to discredit the star witness in the case, Michael Cohen, that, from those of us watching from the cheap seat, seemed to go awry. Attorney Robert Costello, who claimed that Michael Cohen told him Trump did not know about the hush money payments, was literally undone by his own words, specifically emails that he wrote and sent that showed that he aimed to pressure Michael Cohen into protecting Donald Trump by repeatedly invoking Donald Trump. The New York Times notes this: the defense had hoped to damage Mr. Cohen, a key prosecution witness, beyond repair. Mr. Costello's choppy performance may be remembered, too. The Trump election interference hush money trial in its final stages is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us at the table, NBC News correspondent Yasmin Vasuvian is here, plus former top official at the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman's back with us. Also joining us, former U.S. attorney, former deputy assistant attorney general Harry Litman's here. So, Andrew, we've lived in, and you've been joining us at 5, and we've all been living together in what's been happening as we've come on the air. Today's sort of the first day to exhale and kind of process what was happening. And I have to say, every day, what we had sort of prepared to read and present to our viewers based on what had happened before 4 o'clock in the East was not what we ended up covering, because something something twisted, something turned, something happened in a way that no one expected it to.
So interesting. I was going to say, I have never done a trial where something unexpected doesn't happen. You can prepare all you want, and some piece of evidence, something takes on a life of its own. The other thing, and I used to prepare witnesses this way when I had witnesses like Michael Cohen, is I would say to them, look, no one can prepare you for everything. It's just not possible. Something's going to be presented, and this is what you need to know. No matter what it is, just remember, just think in your head, what is the truth about, just think about what you remember and just say it. It doesn't matter if it's really bad. It doesn't matter if you're saying I stole money from the defendant. Whatever it is, just remember your lodestar at that moment is the truth. And I think just related to this trial, it goes to I think, frankly, the only point where the defense actually scored any sort of surprising point was on what I think now is just a lot of theater. And I think it was also sort of to me, I took it as a test of how Michael Cohen was prepared and how he did on the stand, which is, I thought he actually answered with that kind of lodestar in mind, which is, he's like, that is still what I remember.
Yeah.
And then when the photo came out, it really, to me, was important because I kept on thinking about, he did not know when he was talking about a phone call where the record was with Keith Schiller that was going to be at a time that Donald Trump was actually going to be there. I mean, what if he said that and it turns out that Donald Trump was actually giving a speech or was in a different location, and it turns out he was like, no, I think that's when it happened. And I thought it was a sort of, to me, it was something I would argue as very corroborative of him. And so I think I'm not surprised that something unexpected happened that changed the narrative in terms of what we're going to talk about, but that is how trials work.
Well, and in terms of a plot twist that changes the entire narrative, and again, we have no idea how the jury experienced any of the witnesses or any of the testimony, but we do know that the jury saw the courtroom cleared out multiple occasions for only one witness, and that was Robert Costello.
That was such a huge mistake. I don't know for a fact, but it has to be that was Donald Trump's decision with a tin ear as to at least how it played to me. I'm not speaking for the jurors. It did so many things. We've been talking before we came on air, it corroborates Michael Cohen as to who this guy is and why he didn't trust him. So he's an exhibit in that sense. It showed that Donald Trump was the leader, that he was at the head of this. It showed an obstruction conspiracy of trying to keep Michael Cohen from being heard by this jury. I mean, that is what I would argue to the jurors. It's like that man, meaning the defendant, did not want you to hear from that man on the witness stand, and that's because he knew he had the goods. I mean, it was, and just his demeanor, to your point, in terms of Michael Cohen is the person we thought would behave like Bob Costello, and Bob Costello behaved in a way that was, there's no way that the jury did not react to that. I mean, by that point in the trial, they've lived with the most dispassionate, lovely, judge with incredible judicial temperament, and juries in general like judges, and here they have every reason to like this particular judge. There's no way that they did not think this was highly inappropriate, and this is the defendant's case.
Yeah, I mean, again, we don't know if the jury is consuming the evidence in a narrative sweep. It was certainly presented as such by the prosecution. And in the narrative sweep that the prosecution presented, it was a story about a conspiracy that is conceived of in a meeting in Trump Tower in 2015, and the principals are David Pecker and Donald Trump. And the person who's sort of a mid-level staffer in that conspiracy is Michael Cohen. The story concludes dramatically in the cross-examination of the defense's only narrative witness, and that's Costello. And the prosecution gets to land on new evidence of the effort to suppress the mid-level staffer, who in every mob movie is the guy that sort of flips because he's got the books, or he steals the books, or he copies the books, and Trump's role as the person who would make sure that everyone could sleep, that Michael Cohen could sleep well at night because he had a friend in a high place. The only person that Costello was talking about at the White House was Donald Trump.
I think back first to Susan Hoffmanger's direct on Michael Cohen and how they set up the narrative of Robert Costello without knowing at the time that Robert Costello was going to be called as a defense witness, because for all intents and purposes, Robert Costello was a late ad. On Friday, when our own Tom Winter reached out to Robert Costello as to whether or not he was going to testify, he said he was ready, willing, and able, actually wanted to testify, but had not yet spoken to the lead defense attorney, Todd Blanche. But even in that narrative, in setting up Robert Costello in this relationship, Hoffinger asked Michael Cohen as to whether or not he told the truth to Robert Costello about Stormy Daniels and Donald Trump. Did they have sex? She asked him. And he said, no, he didn't tell him the truth. And in fact, he didn't trust him. And that is why he did not tell him the truth. And I remember when that moment happened, I remember talking about it on television at the time as to why Michael Cohen said he did not retain this individual who was a good friend of Rudy Giuliani's, who had emailed him and saying, you have friends in high places, sleep well tonight. I am meeting with my client or my friend who is meeting with his client, meaning Rudy Giuliani and the president of the United States at the time. What do you want me to communicate with them? So then when Robert Costello took the stand and acted the way in which he did in that courthouse, going to Andrew's point, really kind of corroborating Michael Cohen's testimony, a lot of jurors, I imagine, walked away on that, what was it, Monday, when Robert Costello first took the stand. And instead of thinking about Michael Cohen and what may have come from that testimony, they likely walked away thinking about Robert Costello and the way in which he acted towards Judge Juan Merchan. I mean, remember, this jury was very focused, and you and I saw it, especially with Stormy Daniels. Their energy feeds off of Judge Juan Merchan. And if Juan Merchan is not into one of the witnesses or feels as if the witness is being disrespectful or not answering the question succinctly, then he holds them to account. And I imagine they were feeding off of the same energy that they felt from Juan Merchan when Robert Costello was on the stand and, rolling his eyes at Juan Merchan, staring him down. I can't imagine they walked away thinking much about Michael Cohen at that point and instead thinking about Robert Costello and thinking Michael Cohen likely corroborated, or Robert Costello corroborated Michael Cohen's testimony.
And to the degree, Harry Litman, that they're going to be asked to make relative judgments, that, yeah, there was this one question on one day about one call that made me wonder if Michael Cohen was telling the truth about what he talked about with Schiller on the 24th. But, the defense's only person that came up and spoke for the defendant's innocence, if you will, if that was his objective, it's not even clear to me that it was, he's much worse than anything they said about Michael Cohen and anything that came out about Michael Cohen on cross. I mean, how much do juries take into consideration the relativity in terms of the credibility of one witness over the other?
I think it's the key question, and then the short answer is quite a bit. So, as you say, we trooped up after every court day when there were twists and turns and covered them breathlessly. It's not how the jury experienced it. The jury did experience it more as a narrative sweep. It's the way jurors are supposed to experience, and they make overall judgments who's telling the truth and who isn't. So I think in part because he was fairly unperturbed or honest on the stand, as Andrew says, it wasn't a seismic moment for them when Cohen was a little bit knocked off his feet. Whereas Costello, that's like, the principal coming into the classroom in second grade. That is really memorable, and they noticed it, and I'm sure they talked about it a lot in the back. But the important point is it corroborates a general story, and I think, at 12 people, you never know. But my experience, I think Andrew would substantiate this, is jurors make general judgments about who's being straight and who isn't. Not just Cohen, but Stormy Daniels and Pecker have warts as witnesses, but you could tell they gave it a story that coheres with one another and is basically the truth. And I think that general impression is what they'll take coming Tuesday when the prosecution prosecution tries to tie it all together and not the sort of isolated, if dramatic points where he's not, knocked back a little bit.
So how does the prosecution close?
I think the big picture for the prosecution is twofold. This is true for every single trial I've ever seen or done. The prosecution needs to make sure that the jury is going to consider all of the proof together. And I know that may sound like, yeah, Andrew, of course, but the defense is constantly saying this piece doesn't prove the case. This piece does. Look at all the data about this piece. Yeah. But that's not how a trial works. And I always give this example when I was summing up about the police arrive in an apartment and the defendant's there and there's a dead body on the floor and the defendant has a gun and there's a bullet in the dead body and the person says, I did it. And the defense says there's nothing wrong with finding a dead body in your house. There's nothing wrong with saying the words, I did it. There's nothing wrong with owning a gun. Now, they separate each piece without looking at it all. And here, that's going to be really important because you want them to consider just the massive amounts of evidence when you put together Pecker and McConney and Hicks and the defendant's admissions. You can do this all without Michael Cohen is not even mentioned yet. You can talk about Costello, and you can talk about physical pieces of evidence, exhibits 35 and 36, the handwritten notes, the telephone records. And you want to say, look at this entire picture. The idea that Donald Trump, the cheapskate micromanager that is conceded by Todd Blanche, he did not know. There'd be zero reason for him not to know and every reason for him to know. So you want to sort of put that all together. And then you turn to Michael Cohen, because you can sort of make an incredibly strong case and say, you don't even need that. And then let's talk about all the ways he's corroborated and tells you from the inside what was happening. So I think that is,
Do you bring in Costello, and then you heard from Trump's own?
Absolutely. I would be using him in all sorts of ways and stressing, like, this is their case, and it actually supports what we said. And I would use it to your point, to completely corroborate Michael Cohen. He is an exhibit to exactly. You think you don't trust him? You saw him. Right. Would you trust him?
How bad is he? He's so bad. This convicted felon didn't trust him.
Right. And he said, you know what? I thought he was going to go right back to Donald Trump. It's in black and white that he did that. So you use that, but you also use it to say, let's just talk about obstruction in this case. Let's just talk about what was going on, about what happens in these cases, and who is doing it, and who has put this person forward for you as their defense. They didn't have to do anything, right? They don't have any burden, but they chose to put this person on as their defense.
Still to come for us, the latest bat bleep pile of absolutely insane lunacy metastasizing deep within the Republican Party, spewing out to an electorate ready, willing, and eager to eat it up and potentially act on it. Donald Trump's latest bold-faced lie that could pose a new and growing threat to our nation's law enforcement officials. So, granted, Donald Trump's campaign has used lies without any shame, without flinching or blinking, to mobilize and animate and energize its supporters on a daily basis, as easily and frequently as the rest of us breathe. But believe me when I tell you that this time it's different. Disinformation of a stripe and variety that goes well beyond the size of his crowds or his golf scores. A dangerous lie this time. We reported it for you yesterday. Trump's entirely false assertion that the Department of Justice authorized the FBI to use deadly force in its 2022 court-approved search of Mar-a-Lago. That lie has exploded. The campaign used it in a fundraising email suggesting that President Joe Biden was, quote, locked and loaded, ready to, quote, take him out on the day the court-approved search warrant was carried out. Then the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Paul Gosars of the world, Trump surrogates, augmented and amplified that lie, suggesting President Joe Biden had intended to assassinate Trump. And his allies in conservative media, what did they do? Well, watch.
This was an attempted assassination attempt on Donald John Trump.
Why was Merrick Garland prepping for a possible, shootout? Why did agents roll up, guns at the ready?
Maybe they wanted to come in without FBI, without, DOJ, without all of that, identifying so that they could engage in deadly physical force.
Deadly force. Does that mean that Joe Biden was authorizing the FBI to if it came to that and he resisted arrest, it would be okay to kill Donald Trump?
That's what it seems.
So I won't describe them all in one broad brush, but most of those people are smart enough to know that what they were saying was Bill Barr's favorite word, bullshit. Not all of them. And to believe any of this, you have to ignore the facts that are in front of our eyes. For instance, why would President Joe Biden put any such order on paper? Why would anybody do that? Wait for a specific moment when Trump was not at Mar-a-Lago and then just do that? Well, he wouldn't. Neither would the Department of Justice. Why would the Department of Justice use the same language in the search warrant for Mar-a-Lago executed by the FBI at President Joe Biden's home? Were they going to get him too, right? Get two for quite a summer. Did the president intend to assassinate himself or someone else there in his own house? The reality is different, and the FBI has already explained what the reality is. That this language is standard, it's boilerplate, it is the norm in going about executing a search warrant. But as always, Trump and his enablers are not interested in letting the facts, even when they could put the lives of law enforcement officials in America, they're not interested in those facts getting in the way of a dangerous new conspiracy theory spreading like wildfire. Joining our coverage, former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI, author of the soon-to-be-released book, Long Haul, Hunting the Highway Serial Killers, Frank Figliuzzi joins me and David and Vaughn. Frank, your thoughts?
I don't know whether to laugh or cry, but this is so gravely serious that it can't be treated as humor. We've lost a segment of our population that either is incapable or seems incapable of doing independent thought and their own research. But some of those people did their own research when it came to the pandemic, and they decided, some of them, to ingest fish tank cleanser because they thought it was an acceptable form of ivermectin. Look, the other group of people are people who absolutely know, as you said, they're smart enough to know that you can look this stuff up and it's verifiable, and yet they continue to shovel it into their followers' mouths, who swallow it whole. I have done countless ops orders, written them, approved them, been physically on search warrants and arrest warrant service, and I can tell you I can't recall seeing an ops order that did not include the deadly force policy. You know why? Because it's required. And if people were smart enough to look at the released document, the unsealed document from the court, if you'd see in the bottom right corner a federal form, an FD form. There's a number there. That means this is a template that we use every single time. It does not change. And the part that stays in there is that deadly force policy. So I would ask some of the people who are saying, my God, why was this even necessary to restate it? Even if it's required, why would you do it? Because it's in every document, and because in my experience, when you send people in and say, this is low threat, low risk, no worries, somebody gets hurt. I can give you example after example, including examples where people got killed because they weren't vigilant on a seemingly routine search or arrest. Agents killed because they weren't vigilant and on what seemed like a routine situation. The fact that it's in the Biden consensual search, and I emphasize consensual, everybody was cooperating. You can't get lower risk than that, but yet the deadly force policy was in that too, because you don't take it out. And things happen. Murphy's Law happens all the time in law enforcement. Things go south on you quickly, often with people unrelated to the case. Some contractor shows up, the girlfriend shows up with a shotgun, somebody does something unexpected, and God forbid the FBI told those agents at Mar-a-Lago, hey, you know what, today don't bring your guns. Don't bring them. And then someone gets killed. That's not the way it works.
You know, David Jolly, there's a lot of projection. And here we go, year 9 of covering Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is right now arguing before the United States Supreme Court. He has argued, he's waiting for a ruling on what he believes would be or should be absolute immunity to use SEAL Team 6 to assassinate, Trump's word, a political rival. The idea that anyone who typed and sent this thinks that there's any truth to the fact that anyone was trying to assassinate Trump is something I can't believe. I don't believe that they're that dumb. I mean, these people are a lot of things. Steve Bannon is a lot of things. I don't have enough time on the air to say them all. I do think if someone loved him a little bit more, he would do something about the look. But he's a lot of things. He's not stupid. And he knows damn well that nobody was trying to assassinate Donald Trump. But this is the kind of lie that's going to get the people that they view as their people killed. I mean, who do they think carries out? I mean, this is going to endanger the life of every man and woman in law enforcement who has to knock on a door, who I understand from law enforcement, that's some of the most dangerous, harrowing moments. Those are the moments that sometimes you call your family before. Those are the most dangerous moments in a workday that a lot of men and women in law enforcement face.
Yeah, Nicole, this is one of those moments where you can kind of see the fine line in Republican politics between the knowing, lying, bad actor manipulators, right? The Donald Trumps and Steve Bannons, and just the raw idiots like the Marjorie Taylor Greene and others who truly don't understand the facts of the case, are just going to amplify this. But both of them, both of those lanes, the manipulators and the idiots, are both contributing to real danger in the United States, because the imagery of this, the storytelling of this, excites people who then engage possibly in violence in response, right? This is nothing more than what Donald Trump said, go to the Capitol with strength, not weakness, because on January 6th, they only understand strength. Now when Donald Trump is saying, I'm a victim, they're coming for me because they're coming for you, and oh, by the way, they're coming for me with weapons, with a possible assassination, you better believe that that excites some of the most unstable. And that's where, you know, those like the Steve Bannons, I don't know what Donald Trump understands in his own head and heart, but the people who know better, the Sean Hannitys and some of those Fox News voices that you heard, they know that they are speaking to an audience that could be excited by this. It used to be a rule in politics that you de-escalate things. Part of leadership is settling things down, de-escalating. That is no longer the case when it comes to Trumpism in today's Republican Party. It's a dangerous moment, whether they're intending to do it or whether they're just raw idiots.
I'll let you take a pass on the idiots versus intentional breakdown and who falls on what side. But what's amazing is there's no one in law enforcement in the Trump coalition who came out and said, whoa, you know, to do exactly what David Jolly said, de-escalate.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, we had a man who went and entered the Speaker of the House's home and attacked her husband. And who knows what would have happened if she was the one inside of there. People carry out these acts. There's crazy people out there. And to steal from my producer colleague, Dan, on the road with me, the way that he puts it is there are those who would not pass the lie detector test. Those like Steve Bannon, those like Charlie Kirk and Benny Johnson and Sean Hannity. They know that what they're saying is a lie. They know it's false. They know that the FBI wasn't sent in to assassinate. But there's a great share, potentially millions, right, that would pass the lie detector test, that do truly believe that, and they are the ones that are then echoing those statements there.
Some of the most extreme plans for restricting women's access to health care are moving more and more into the Republican mainstream. The GOP presumptive nominee for president, Donald Trump, has opened the door to placing more restrictions on birth control. Yes, this is happening.
Do you support any restrictions on a person's right to contraception?
Well, we're looking at that, and I'm going to have a policy on that very shortly. And I think it's something that you'll find interesting. And it's another issue that's very interesting. But you will find it, I think, very smart. I think it's a smart decision. But we'll be releasing it very soon.
It's interesting and it's smart. I just don't know what it is yet because I haven't thought of it yet because I didn't even really understand your question. That was the disgraced ex-president in a live interview yesterday, saying, among other things, that he's very much leaving the door open to possibly restricting or maybe even banning birth control if he's elected president. Again, if he even understood the question that was put to him, it's not clear from the interview. While Trump attempted today to walk back even that unclear muddle of those comments, posting on social media this, quote, "I do not support a ban on birth control, and neither will the Republican Party," end quote. The only problem is that the people setting his agenda, his handpicked advisors, as well as leadership of the current Republican Party, are either already doing it or have made it abundantly clear that now that Trump helped them strip away a constitutional right to an abortion, they are coming for birth control next, and IVF, and all the other things that we have been warned about for years. Trump's advisors at Project 2025 have made banning birth control a key part of the agenda for a second Trump presidency. It's a position very much supported by a very vocal and enthusiastic House Speaker in Mike Johnson. He spent his career trying to dismantle access to women's health care, specifically birth control. It's also echoed by Senate Republicans who blocked a bill enshrining a federal right to contraception. And when Trump's handpicked justices on the United States Supreme Court helped to overturn the protections of Roe, they laid the groundwork to come for birth control next in their opinions. But don't worry, Trump tweeted that he was against birth control bans, if he even saw it. Joining our coverage, the president of Reproductive Freedom for All, Mini Timuraju. So tell me, what is the most important piece about this interview for you?
You know, you pointed out it's not clear that Donald Trump himself understands the question or even the answer. What's more important is that the party has been consistently anti-birth control, anti-reproductive freedom. For example, Project 2025, we've talked about it on this show. He's affiliated with a larger network of extremist Republican conservatives that are the architects of these attacks. And we have no doubt that if he becomes president again, he will continue down this road. All we know, we have the proof, which is overturning of Roe. So we just have to keep reminding folks, he overturned Roe. He appointed those justices. He bragged about it. He wants to punish patients and providers. And that naturally leads down the road to going after contraception. And that's really important.
What is the most important political imperative? Is it making sure voters know what Republicans have already said and what they already stand for? Or is it moving this issue? Is it making clear to people how central this is to our ability to function as families, as women, as Americans?
I think it's all of the above, but with an emphasis on what the Republicans have done and what they will do, and specifically what Trump can do with or without Congress. Birth control is very popular, right? Over 90% of Americans have a positive experience, including
98% of Democrats, 67% of Republicans.
That's right. So including conservatives, including Republicans. It's much like the IVF story, right? So this ideological bent about life begins at conception and this extremist viewpoint on power and control of women's bodies, it extends and always has to birth control. That's why we've seen fights against things like Title X, the nation's family planning program, right? That's why you've seen family planning programs in conservative red states be cut and slashed, even before Dobbs. So we have to call attention that this is the Republican record. Chuck Schumer just said today he's going to call for a vote on the Right to Contraception Act, as well as the Tammy Duckworth's IVF Act, the first week of June. So Republicans have a chance to really show where they stand. We know where they stand. We need to make sure the American people follow those votes.
How our politics came to this right now, today. We'll be joined here on set by my friend, longtime journalist, former White House senior staffer, George Stephanopoulos. His new book is called The Situation Room, the inside story of presidents in crisis. It's fantastic. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere. The sit room on January 6th. Let me read what's in the book. With reports coming in from the Secret Service and other officials on Capitol Hill, the Situation Room scrambled into action. Quote, things got very chaotic. This is Mike Stigler, the Situation Room officer. He told you, quote, we went into a continuity of government situation. Stop there. Take in that phrase, continuity of government situation. That bland bit of bureaucratic jargon masks a deadly serious set of policies and actions, first ordered by President Eisenhower at the height of the Cold War. COG was designed to ensure that the government would still function after a disaster such as nuclear war. It involves secret command centers, the sit room being a critical one, elaborate chains of command, the relocation of Congress, and the replacement of executive branch officials killed in attacks. It had been activated only once before in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 terror
When
attacks.
Mike Stiegler told me that on the Zoom, I stopped breathing.
I didn't know that. Has that been?
It was the first time I had heard it. You know, we tried to run it down, and we know that happened on 9/11 as well. But think about that. He was on the phone with the Secret Service. He was on the phone with others on Capitol Hill who were telling him the vice president's life is in danger. And he tells me the most horrible part of that day is not knowing if Pence is going to make it through that day. And they're planning for an alternate government to be set up. What is the President of the United States doing? We all know what the President of the United States was doing. He's sitting up in his study, sipping Diet Coats, and sending out a tweet attacking Mike Pence. Did not call down to the Situation Room once during that insurrection.
What is it? I mean, you could take any corner, right, on the 18 acres, and then he debased it, right? He, you know, from his post-COVID ripping, I mean, the whole thing. But there's something about the sit room where shit was always so real, right? Nothing, whatever, even if there were fights going on between, you got in the sit room because something bad was happening.
Something bad was happening. And they're getting incoming 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A lot of it turns out to be false, but they're on the front lines taking in all of this information. And think about the history of the Situation Room. They've dealt with assassinations. They've dealt with attempted assassinations. They've dealt with 9/11. They've dealt with wars. They had never had to deal with an insurrection inspired by the president himself. And the people in the sit room, Mike Stiegler, one of them, he said it took him years to process what was happening that day. He and his friends who served that day couldn't speak. They had to go to work the next day, but they couldn't speak when they left the White House that day. And they still meet every January 6th. They go to the Lincoln Memorial and raise a glass to the fact that at least the Republic stood. The Republic did survive that day, but they had to deal with something that is really unimaginable in our times. And now, again, to go back to what we talked about at the beginning, people want to make it seem like it was normal.
I think about, I mean, obviously I was in the White House on September 11th when COG was put in place, and the pictures, I mean, Cheney and Mary Madeline.
You're down in the PIAC,
you were covering the Bush White House in which I served. Talked to my boss, Dan Bartlett, every day. I remember I was sitting there, who's that? Is George? And and you had all the best information, all the best reporting. And we actually tried to the extent we could talk about what was going on. But the country agreed on the horror of that day. And I don't think anything takes away the pain, and I'm not trying to compare the two tragedies, but in terms of our telling and our story as a country, there's not a lot of divisiveness around the story we tell about September 11th. I wonder what it's like for the men and women who worked in the Situation Room, or the men and women who defended the United States Capitol, and they weren't protecting the Democrats or the Republicans. They paid with their bodies. Some of them paid with their jobs. Some of them paid with their lives.
They were protecting the institutions.
Right.
And, you know, I spoke with Mike Stiegler again last week, and one of the things that gratified me is that after we talked to him and showed him on Good Morning America, he sent me a text in the morning thanking me, because he said since he's spoken out, several of his colleagues have now felt more able to process it, more able to talk about it, able to put it into context. For the long time, they felt like they couldn't talk about it, and they couldn't understand what had happened, and they didn't necessarily have the support. And they've found the support among each other.
You know, I wonder, if you take the events of Waco and you take Oklahoma City and you put some of the characters on the board again. I mean, Merrick Garland prosecutes Oklahoma City. Donald Trump announces his candidacy in Waco, and Donald Trump is taunting Merrick Garland for wanting to hold him accountable for January 6th. How do all the pieces fit together in your head?
Well, I mean, I think that there's been a lot of anger in America for a long time, and Donald Trump has tapped into it. There's just no question about that, an anti-establishment anger. What surprised me more is what was a relatively small, considered extreme group has now become the majority inside the Republican Party. I think that's, in some ways, the most important story to figure out, and the most important story to reveal. I mean, it's the enablers who've made all of this possible. You know, this could have ended in January 2021. There could have been a conviction. That could have been, and you have a lot of people like Mitch McConnell who said, well, we're not going to vote for conviction because he should be tried in a court of law. And now somehow that's illegitimate as well. But it's not even over yet. And I know you know this, Nicole, but think about this. Right now, the President Trump continues to lie about the election every single day in every single statement, and to not promise to accept the results if it doesn't go his way in 2024. And you have people falling in line behind that.
Yeah, Rubio just fell.
Rubio did on Meet the Press on Sunday.
Yeah. So what do we do? How do you cover Rubio as someone who won't accept the results of an election that hasn't happened?
I would stop asking the questions after I got that answer. I'm not going to talk to you about anything else.
Are you optimistic about the country?
I'm optimistic about the people. I'm inspired by the people I interviewed for this book. I mean, there are an awful lot of good people working every single day across this government who are trying to do their best for the country, for the presidency. You know, it's just not an overstatement to say this is the most important election we've seen in our lifetime. It just isn't. And I think you tell me what happens in the election, and I'll give you an answer on what I think is going to happen in the day after, because I think it's about the rule of law. It's about the Constitution. It's about the peaceful transfer of power. It's not about politics. It's not about Republican and Democrat. It's about the bedrock of our democracy.
This has been Primetime Weekend. I'm Nicole Wallace. Please tune into Deadline White House and all of our primetime shows weekdays on MSNBC.